They laughed at the black caddie carrying their bags, but none of them knew the announcer was about to call his name. The laughter rolled across the green like a careless echo under the bright afternoon sun. 4 wealthy men stood beside their golf carts near the first tee of the prestigious Lakeshore Charity Invitational. Their polos were crisp, their sunglasses expensive, and their voices carried the easy confidence of men who had spent most of their lives being listened to. Marcus Reed stood quietly beside them with a heavy leather golf bag resting against his shoulder. The strap dug into the muscle near his neck, but his expression did not change. One of the men, Richard Caldwell, chuckled as he adjusted his glove and looked Marcus up and down. "Careful with that bag," he said loudly. "Those clubs cost more than your car." The other men laughed, as if the line had been rehearsed. Marcus simply lowered the bag onto the trimmed grass and began arranging the clubs so they faced the correct direction. His movements were slow and precise, almost practiced. The sun warmed the fairway, and the smell of cut grass drifted through the air. A few spectators stood near the ropes that lined the course, watching the wealthy guests warm up for the charity exhibition round. Marcus kept his eyes down, but he noticed everything. The distance markers, the slope of the green, the quiet breeze that moved across the lake beyond the trees. About 20 feet away, a young boy stood beside one of the carts. The boy was Ethan Caldwell, the son of Richard Caldwell. He looked at Marcus with curiosity rather than amusement. Ethan tilted his head slightly as Marcus lifted one of the clubs and wiped a speck of dust from the polished metal. "Do you ever play?" the boy asked. Marcus glanced toward him for a moment and gave a small, calm smile. "I used to," he said softly. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow is a story you cannot miss. The sound of drivers striking practice balls echoed across the course. One of the Millionaires took a powerful swing and sent a ball sailing down the range while the others applauded. Marcus lifted the golf bag again and stepped forward with steady posture. The leather creaked slightly under the weight. Another man in the group leaned toward Richard Caldwell and spoke just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "You ever notice how these caddies stare at the course like they belong here?" Richard smirked and shrugged. "Everyone wants to feel important for a minute," he replied. Marcus said nothing. His eyes drifted briefly toward the large scoreboard near the clubhouse where the names of the invited players were listed for the afternoon exhibition. The board shimmered in the sunlight, letters standing tall above the crowd gathering near the first tee. A gentle wind moved across the fairway, rippling the flags in the distance. Marcus watched the flag on the first green flutter once before he looked away. Then he adjusted the strap of the golf bag on his shoulder and walked beside the group toward the tee box, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Marcus Reed walked beside the group as they approached the first tee box, the leather golf bag still resting firmly against his shoulder. The trimmed grass glowed under the late afternoon sun, and the gentle breeze drifting from the lake carried the faint smell of water and pine. The Charity Invitational had drawn a respectable crowd. Spectators stood quietly behind the rope lines, some holding drinks, others shielding their eyes from the sun while watching the wealthy guests prepare to play. Richard Caldwell stepped onto the tee box and stretched his shoulders with slow confidence, the kind that came from years of being admired in rooms filled with investors and executives. He glanced back toward Marcus and gave a small, amused shake of his head. "You ever notice how quiet the help gets around rich people?" he said to the man standing beside him. "It is like they think silence makes them invisible." The man beside him laughed and replied that maybe silence was the only safe language for people like that. Marcus heard every word. His face remained calm, almost unreadable, as he set the bag down beside the tee marker. He removed the driver from the bag and offered it to Richard with steady hands. The club gleamed under the sunlight, polished and perfect. Richard accepted it without looking directly at him. Ethan Caldwell stood a few feet away near the golf cart, still watching Marcus with curiosity that had not faded. The boy shifted his weight and asked quietly, "Did you play golf here before?" Marcus paused for a moment before answering. "I played in a lot of places a long time ago," he said gently. Ethan looked impressed in the honest way that only young people could be. My dad says golf is the hardest game in the world, the boy said. Marcus gave a small nod. Your father is not wrong. Richard overheard the exchange and smirked as he placed a ball on the tee. Careful there, kid, he said. You keep listening to the caddy, and you might end up carrying bags for a living too. A few of the men nearby chuckled again. The laughter drifted across the tee box, but it did not linger long. Marcus stepped back and folded his hands in front of him, watching the fairway stretch forward like a long green ribbon disappearing between the trees. Richard took his stance and made a strong practice swing that cut sharply through the air. The sound of the club slicing the breeze turned a few heads among the spectators. Marcus noticed something small that most people would have ignored. Richard had aligned his feet slightly close to the target line. It was the kind of mistake that sent drives curving left into the trees. Marcus did not say anything. The role of a caddy in this moment was simple. Carry the bag. Stay quiet. Do not offer advice unless it was asked for. Richard took another practice swing and looked toward the distant flag on the fairway. Then he struck the ball. The driver exploded against the ball with a loud crack that echoed across the course. For a brief moment, the ball rose beautifully into the sky. Then the curve began. It drifted left, slowly but unmistakably, until it disappeared into a cluster of tall oak trees lining the edge of the fairway. A few spectators murmured softly. Richard lowered the club and frowned at the direction of the shot. Marcus kept his eyes on the trees for another second before lifting the golf bag again. Richard turned toward him with mild irritation and said that maybe the bag was heavier than it looked. Marcus met his eyes for the first time that afternoon. His voice was calm and respectful when he answered. The bag weighs about 40 pounds, sir. Richard raised an eyebrow. 40 pounds, and you carry it all day. Marcus nodded once. All day. Ethan looked between the two men and said quietly that maybe carrying the bag was harder than hitting the ball. Marcus smiled faintly, but did not respond. In the distance, the clubhouse loudspeaker crackled softly as someone tested the microphone for an upcoming announcement. The sound was faint, but clear enough to drift across the first tee. Marcus heard it before anyone else seemed to notice. He glanced briefly toward the clubhouse where the large scoreboard stood beside the patio filled with guests and tournament staff. For a moment, something thoughtful passed across his face. Then he shifted the strap on his shoulder and followed Richard Caldwell down the path toward the trees where the lost ball had fallen. Marcus Reed followed Richard Caldwell and the others along the narrow path that curved toward the tall oak trees where the ball had disappeared. The grass beneath their shoes grew thicker and darker near the edge of the fairway, and the air felt cooler under the wide branches. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered patterns that moved slowly across the ground. Richard walked ahead with the confident stride of someone who expected problems to solve themselves. He swung the driver lightly in one hand while scanning the ground. Somewhere around here, he muttered, though his tone suggested the ball should have been easier to find. Marcus stepped off the path and into the rough without hesitation. The heavy golf bag shifted slightly on his shoulder as he moved through the tall grass. His eyes moved calmly across the ground, reading the terrain the same way a mechanic listens to the sound of an engine. Ethan Caldwell followed a few steps behind his father, careful not to step into the thick brush. The boy watched Marcus closely as the caddy moved through the rough with quiet efficiency. It did not take long for Marcus to spot the ball resting near the base of a large oak tree with a fairway curved back toward the green. He knelt and brushed aside a few dry leaves. There it is, he said in a calm voice. Richard stepped closer and looked down at the ball with mild irritation. Figures, he said. Of course it finds the one tree on the entire hole. The other men laughed again, as if the situation itself had decided to entertain them. Richard studied the angle between the ball and the fairway. The branches above hung low, forming a tangled roof of leaves that blocked a clear shot toward the green. He scratched his chin and looked at the driver still in his hand before handing it back toward Marcus. Give me the 7-iron, he said. Marcus placed the bag on the ground and unzipped the side pocket before pulling out the club with steady hands. He handed it to Richard without speaking. Ethan watched the exchange carefully and then looked at the angle toward the fairway. That tree is blocking everything, the boy said quietly. Richard shrugged, as if the problem was minor. That is why we improvise, son. Golf is a thinking game. Marcus stepped back once Richard took his stance beside the tree. The rough grass brushed softly against Marcus' shoes as he folded his hands together. His eyes moved from the ball to the open space between the branches. He noticed something small again. Richard was aiming too directly at the fairway. If he struck the ball, that way it would climb into the low branches and fall back into the rough. Marcus said nothing. Richard swung the club and struck the ball sharply. The metal rang against the ball with a crisp sound that echoed under the trees. The ball jumped upward exactly as Marcus had expected. It clipped the lowest branch and dropped back to the ground only a few yards ahead of them. One of the other men groaned in mock disappointment while another laughed loudly. Richard lowered the club and looked up at the branch that had stopped the shot. Unbelievable, he said under his breath. Marcus walked forward and lifted the golf bag again. The leather strap creaked slightly as he settled it against his shoulder. Ethan glanced toward him and spoke in a thoughtful voice. Did you know that would happen? Marcus looked down at the ball resting in the rough, and then back toward the open fairway beyond the trees. The wind moved softly through the branches above them. Marcus answered in the same calm tone he had used all afternoon. I had a feeling. Ethan studied his face carefully, as if trying to understand what the man meant. Richard brushed dirt from his glove and looked toward Marcus again. You seem pretty confident for someone carrying the clubs, he said with a hint of sarcasm. Marcus did not react to the remark. He simply shifted the bag slightly and looked toward the fairway once more. From somewhere near the clubhouse, the loudspeaker crackled again as tournament staff prepared for another announcement. The faint sound carried across the course, drifting through the trees like a distant echo. Marcus heard it clearly this time. For a brief moment, he lifted his head toward the clubhouse patio where the crowd had grown larger. Then he returned his attention to the ball lying in the grass as Richard Caldwell prepared to swing again. Richard Caldwell stared at the ball resting stubbornly in the rough while the low branches of the oak tree swayed gently above his head. The air beneath the trees felt cooler now, and the distant murmur of spectators carried softly across the course. Richard rotated the iron slowly in his hands and studied the narrow opening between the branches that led back toward the fairway. The opening was there, but it was thin and unforgiving, like a doorway meant for someone patient enough to aim precisely. One of the other millionaires, standing nearby, folded his arms and chuckled quietly. Looks like that tree just joined the tournament, he said. Richard exhaled through his nose and stepped closer to the ball. Golf had always been a game of pride for him. Investors respected confidence, and confidence did not walk away from a challenge. He positioned his feet again and leaned forward, measuring the distance toward the fairway with narrowed eyes. Marcus Reed stood several feet behind him with the golf bag resting against his shoulder. His posture remained calm, but his eyes were focused on the same narrow opening in the branches. The wind moved softly across the leaves above them, creating a faint rustling sound that mixed with the distant hum of conversation near the clubhouse. Ethan Caldwell shifted his position again, watching both men carefully. The boy pointed quietly toward the right side of the opening and spoke with the honest curiosity that had followed him all afternoon. It looks wider over there, he said. Richard did not answer right away. He kept his eyes fixed on the ball while slowly adjusting his grip. The problem was not only the branches. The ground beneath the ball sloped slightly downward, which meant the club would strike the ball with less lift than expected. Marcus noticed the detail immediately. It was the kind of thing experienced golfers felt in their feet before they even swung. Richard lifted the club back and took another practice swing that brushed the grass lightly. Then he paused and glanced over his shoulder toward Marcus. You look like you have something to say, he remarked with a faint edge in his voice. Marcus remained respectful as always. His tone was calm and steady when he spoke. The opening on the right side gives the ball a cleaner path back to the fairway, sir. Richard stared at him for a moment, as if deciding whether the suggestion was helpful or insulting. One of the other men laughed softly and muttered that the caddie had suddenly become a golf instructor. Richard turned back toward the ball with a small shake of his head. I did not ask for advice, he replied. Marcus lowered his eyes slightly and stepped back another pace without arguing. The silence that followed felt heavier than the bag on his shoulder. Richard reset his stance and aimed directly toward the center of the opening, just as he had before. The swing came quickly and with force. The club struck the ball sharply and sent it climbing upward again. For a brief second, the ball appeared to escape the branches. Then the same low limb that had interfered with the previous shot brushed against it once more. The ball dropped straight down and rolled only a short distance forward through the rough grass. The men behind Richard burst into quiet laughter again. One of them clapped a hand against his knee and said that maybe the tree was defending its territory. Richard tightened his jaw and looked down at the ground where the ball had landed. His pride was clearly beginning to feel the weight of the moment. Marcus watched silently and then walked forward to mark the new position of the ball. He placed the golf bag carefully on the ground and stepped aside again. Ethan looked from the fallen ball to Marcus with growing curiosity. The boy spoke in a softer voice now, almost as if he had discovered a secret that the others had missed. "You really knew that would happen, did you not?" Marcus looked toward the fairway, where sunlight stretched across the green grass in a long, bright ribbon. His expression remained thoughtful but calm. "Sometimes the course tells you what it wants before you swing," he said quietly. From across the course, the clubhouse loudspeaker crackled again as tournament staff tested the microphone once more. The faint voice drifted through the trees with a brief echo that carried across the fairway. Marcus lifted his head slightly at the sound. The others did not pay attention to it yet. They were too focused on the stubborn ball and the stubborn tree standing between them and the open fairway. Marcus adjusted the strap on his shoulder and waited patiently as Richard Caldwell prepared for another attempt. Richard Caldwell stood over the ball again, while the quiet shade beneath the oak tree seemed to tighten around the group like a small arena. The rough grass brushed against his shoes, and the leaves above continued their soft, restless whisper. The second failed shot had clearly unsettled him, though he tried not to show it. Pride had a way of speaking louder than frustration among men who had spent their lives being admired. One of the other millionaires leaned casually against the trunk of a nearby tree and chuckled again. "That tree has a better defense than most golf courses," he said with amusement. Another man laughed and added that maybe the caddy should climb the branches and hold them back. The remark drew another round of laughter that echoed lightly beneath the leaves. Marcus Reed remained silent. The heavy golf bag rested against his shoulder and the leather strap pressed firmly across his collarbone. His eyes moved once more from the ball to the open fairway beyond the trees. The path was still there, narrow but clear if the shot came from the correct angle. Ethan Caldwell stepped closer to Marcus and lowered his voice slightly, as if he did not want the others to hear. "If you were hitting it, where would you aim?" he asked with quiet curiosity. Marcus looked toward the right side of the opening again, where the sunlight slipped through the leaves and touched the grass in a thin golden line. The boy had noticed the same detail earlier. Marcus answered carefully, "I would send the ball low along that opening, so it runs back onto the fairway." Ethan followed his gaze and nodded slowly, as if the idea made perfect sense to him. Richard overheard the exchange and turned around again with a faint smirk that had returned to his face. "You sure talk a lot for a man carrying a bag," he said. One of the other men laughed and shook his head. "Maybe we should let him take the shot for you, Richard." That comment drew louder laughter this time. Marcus did not react to the joke. He simply lowered the bag from his shoulder and rested it on the ground. The metal heads of the clubs clinked softly together inside the bag. Richard wiped his forehead with the back of his glove and looked down at the ball again. He adjusted his stance once more and aimed directly toward the center of the branches, refusing to accept the smaller opening Marcus had suggested. Pride had made the decision. He swung again with a strong, determined motion. The iron struck the ball with a sharp sound that bounced between the trees. The ball jumped forward quickly and rose into the air. For a moment, it looked promising. Then the same stubborn branch brushed against it for a third time. The ball dropped almost straight down and rolled only a few feet farther along the rough. The laughter stopped this time. Even the men who had been joking moments earlier seemed unsure how to respond to the repeated mistake. Richard lowered the club slowly and stared at the branch above him, as if it had personally challenged him. The silence stretched for several seconds beneath the tree. Marcus stepped forward quietly and lifted the golf bag again. Ethan looked toward his father and then back toward Marcus. The boy seemed to understand something the others were only beginning to suspect. He spoke in a careful voice. "Maybe the tree is not the problem," he said. Richard did not answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly as he looked at the ball lying in the rough once more. Marcus waited patiently a few steps behind him. From across the fairway, the clubhouse loudspeaker crackled again as tournament staff prepared to make another announcement. This time the voice testing the microphone was louder and clearer than before. The faint echo carried across the open grass and drifted beneath the oak branches. Several spectators near the rope line turned their heads toward the clubhouse patio where the large scoreboard stood beside the gathered crowd. Marcus lifted his eyes toward the distant building for a brief moment. Something calm and thoughtful passed across his face again. Then he returned his attention to the ball at Richard Caldwell's feet while the quiet wind continued to move through the leaves above them. Richard Caldwell remained standing over the stubborn golf ball while the quiet shade beneath the oak tree seemed heavier than before. The earlier laughter had faded, replaced by a silence that carried a faint tension through the group. Even the men who had been joking moments earlier now watched with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. Pride had placed Richard in a difficult position. Walking the ball out to the fairway would feel like surrender, yet the narrow opening between the branches continued to challenge him. Marcus Reed stood several steps behind him with the golf bag resting once again against his shoulder. The weight pressed in his collarbone, but his posture remained calm and steady. His eyes moved once more toward the thin strip of sunlight that passed through the right side of the branches and touched the grass beyond the tree. The path was still there, quiet, precise, waiting for someone willing to trust it. Ethan Caldwell noticed Marcus looking toward the same opening again. The boy stepped closer and lowered his voice. "That way still looks easier," he said carefully. Marcus gave a small nod. "Sometimes the easiest path is the one people do not want to take," he replied. Richard heard the quiet conversation again and turned slowly toward them. The faint smirk had returned to his face, though it carried a sharper edge this time. "You two planning the shot together now," he said. One of the other men laughed softly and said that perhaps the caddie had been studying the course all morning. Richard shook his head and exhaled slowly as he looked back at the ball. Golf rewarded patience, but it punished stubbornness. The branch above seemed to hang lower with every failed attempt. Richard wiped his glove across his forehead and spoke again without looking back. "If you know so much about the shot, why do you not show us how it is done?" he said with a tone that carried more sarcasm than invitation. The other men chuckled again, as if the suggestion itself were ridiculous. Marcus remained quiet for a moment. The wind moved gently through the oak leaves above them, sending small flickers of sunlight across the rough grass. He shifted the golf bag from his shoulder and placed it carefully on the ground. The metal heads of the clubs touched softly together with a faint ringing sound. Richard watched him with raised eyebrows as Marcus stepped forward to examine the ball resting in the rough. Marcus did not reach for a club. He simply looked at the ground beneath the ball and then toward the opening in the branches. His voice remained calm and respectful. "The ground slopes slightly downward here, sir. The ball will stay low if it is struck cleanly." Richard crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. One of the other men muttered that the caddie sounded like a coach. Ethan looked between them with growing interest. Marcus continued quietly. "If the shot follows that opening on the right, the ball will run back onto the fairway." The silence that followed stretched for several seconds beneath the tree. Richard looked toward the opening Marcus had indicated. For the first time, he seemed to consider the possibility seriously. The narrow path between the branches did lead toward open grass, though it required a softer and more precise swing than the powerful strikes he had attempted before. Richard finally reached down and handed the iron toward Marcus again. "Hold this for a moment," he said. Marcus accepted the club and rested it against the bag. Richard crouched slightly and brushed a few leaves away from the ball, as if trying to understand the lie better. Ethan watched his father closely. and the boy looked toward Marcus again. "Have you ever played in a tournament before?" he asked quietly. Marcus did not answer right away. His eyes drifted briefly toward the distant clubhouse where the large scoreboard stood above the patio filled with guests and tournament staff. The loudspeaker crackled once more in the distance as someone prepared to speak into the microphone. The faint echo carried across the course, drifting through the trees like a quiet signal. Marcus turned back toward the ball and gave Ethan a small, calm smile. "A long time ago," he said. Richard stood upright again and looked toward the opening beneath the branches. The faint sound of the loudspeaker testing the microphone continued to drift across the fairway while the group waited beneath the oak tree. None of them realized that within a few minutes that same loudspeaker would say a name that would change the entire mood of the afternoon. Richard Caldwell stood motionless for several seconds after Marcus Reed finished speaking. The quiet beneath the oak tree felt different now. The earlier laughter had faded completely, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of voices near the clubhouse. Richard looked once more toward the narrow opening on the right side of the branches where sunlight slipped through and touched the fairway beyond. For the first time that afternoon, he seemed to consider the possibility that the caddie standing behind him might actually understand the shot better than he did. Pride, however, did not disappear easily. One of the other millionaires cleared his throat and said with a playful tone that perhaps the tree had decided to become the champion of the hole. Another man chuckled quietly, though the humor sounded weaker than before. Ethan Caldwell continued watching Marcus carefully. The boy sensed something the others were only beginning to notice. Marcus was not nervous. He was not embarrassed. He stood calmly with the golf bag resting against his shoulder as if the entire moment were simply another quiet afternoon on a familiar course. Richard finally stepped back from the ball and looked toward Marcus again. The expression on his face carried curiosity mixed with irritation. "You really think that opening works?" he asked. Marcus answered with the same respectful calm he had used since the beginning of the round. "Yes, sir. If the ball stays low, it will run back onto the fairway." Richard studied him for another moment before glancing again toward the thin path of sunlight beneath the branches. The shot required restraint, less power, more precision, the opposite of the strong swings he had used before. Richard took a slow breath and repositioned his feet beside the ball. This time his stance angled slightly toward the right side of the opening Marcus had described. Ethan noticed the adjustment immediately and smiled faintly. The boys stepped a little closer, watching the setup carefully. Marcus remained still behind them. He said nothing more. The wind shifted gently across the leaves above the group, causing small flecks of sunlight to move across the rough grass. Richard lifted the iron and made a slower practice swing, brushing the grass softly rather than cutting through it. With force, the motion looked different from the earlier swings. More controlled, more deliberate. One of the other men raised an eyebrow and leaned slightly toward the others. "Looks like the caddie is coaching after all," he murmured. Richard ignored the comment and focused on the ball. The iron moved back smoothly and then came forward in a control motion. The club struck the ball with a sharp, clean sound that echoed beneath the tree. The ball jumped forward and stayed low exactly as Marcus had predicted. It slipped through the narrow opening between the branches and rolled across the short grass of the fairway beyond the trees. The spectators near the rope line let out a quiet murmur of approval. Ethan clapped his hands once in excitement before quickly stopping himself. Richard straightened slowly and followed the path of the ball with his eyes. It rolled nearly 30 yards along the fairway before coming to rest in a perfect position for the next shot. The men behind him looked surprised. One of them gave a short whistle. "Well, I will be," he said quietly. Richard turned his head slightly toward Marcus again. The smirk was gone now. In its place was a thoughtful expression he had not worn earlier in the afternoon. Marcus lifted the golf bag from the ground and settled the strap against his shoulder again. His face remained calm, though Ethan noticed the small hint of satisfaction in his eyes. From the clubhouse patio, the loudspeaker crackled once more, this time followed by the clearer voice of a tournament official speaking into the microphone. The announcement drifted across the fairway toward the first hole where spectators had begun gathering in larger numbers. Marcus heard the voice immediately and lifted his head slightly. Richard and the others were still watching the ball resting on the fairway when the first words of the announcement echoed across the course. The official voice sounded formal and confident as it welcomed the guests to the exhibition round. The breeze carried the sound through the trees while the crowd, near the clubhouse, grew quiet. Marcus adjusted the strap of the golf bag and looked once more toward the distant scoreboard beside the patio. Something calm passed across his face again, the same quiet expression he had shown several times that afternoon. None of the men beside him understood yet why the announcement had caught his attention. The ball resting safely on the fairway changed the mood beneath the oak tree more than anyone expected. A moment earlier the air had been filled with quiet laughter and careless remarks, but now the group stood in thoughtful silence. Richard Caldwell watched the ball for several seconds as if it had rolled there by some unexpected accident. The shot had worked exactly the way Marcus Reed described it. Not powerful, not dramatic, just precise and controlled. One of the other millionaires finally broke the silence with a low whistle. "That was a lucky guess," he said, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes moved slowly from the fairway back toward Marcus. The caddie stood quietly with the golf bag on his shoulder, the same calm posture he had carried since the beginning of the afternoon. Ethan Caldwell stepped forward and looked up at Marcus with open admiration. "You knew that would work," the boy said. Marcus gave a small, respectful nod. "The course speaks if you listen carefully," he replied. Richard rubbed his chin and studied him again. There was something about the way Marcus had said it that no longer sounded like a guess. It sounded like experience. The group began walking toward the fairway where the ball had rolled. The grass grew smoother and brighter once they stepped out from beneath the shade of the trees. The sunlight stretched across the hole like a golden carpet leading toward the green in the distance. Spectators behind the rope line followed the movement of the players with quiet interest. Some of them had noticed the earlier trouble beneath the tree and now watched with curiosity. Marcus walked several steps behind Richard carrying the golf bag without effort. The leather creaked softly with each step. Ethan stayed beside him, occasionally glancing up as if trying to solve a puzzle. "My father says you have to practice for years to understand a golf course," the boy said quietly. Marcus smiled faintly. "Your father is right," he replied. "Golf teaches patience." Richard reached the ball first and placed the head of his club gently behind it. The lie on the fairway was perfect now. Clean grass, clear path toward the green. Richard looked toward the flag in the distance and measured the yardage in his mind. Then he turned again, toward Marcus. For a moment it seemed as if he might ask another question, but pride stopped him before the words formed. Instead, he held out his hand toward the bag. 8 iron, he said. Marcus handed him the club without hesitation. The other men stood nearby, watching with quiet interest. The earlier laughter had faded into something more respectful. Richard took his stance and struck the ball cleanly toward the green. The shot rose high into the air and landed softly near the front edge of the putting surface. A few spectators clapped politely. Richard nodded with satisfaction and began walking toward the green. Ethan lingered beside Marcus for another moment. "If you played before, were you good?" the boy asked. Marcus looked toward the distant clubhouse where the large scoreboard stood above the patio, crowded with guests and tournament staff. His eyes rested there for a moment longer than usual. "I did all right," he said quietly. The sound of the loudspeaker returned again from the direction of the clubhouse. This time the voice carried more clearly across the course. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Lakeshore Charity Invitational Exhibition Round." The voice echoed gently across the fairway, and several spectators turned toward the clubhouse patio where the announcer stood beside the microphone. Marcus heard every word. The strap of the golf bag shifted slightly on his shoulder as he adjusted his posture. Ethan followed his gaze toward the clubhouse and asked if something interesting was happening there. Marcus did not answer immediately. The announcer continued speaking, welcoming sponsors and guests while the crowd near the patio grew quiet to listen. Richard and the others were already approaching the green, focused on the next putt. Marcus remained near the fairway edge for a brief moment longer, watching the scoreboard beside the announcer's stand. The calm expression on his face returned again, the same quiet look he had worn several times throughout the afternoon. Ethan noticed it and tilted his head with curiosity. Marcus finally began walking again, following the group toward the green while the announcer voice continued echoing across the course. None of the men ahead of him realized that the next words spoken through that microphone would soon bring the entire crowd to complete silence. The putting green shimmered under the late afternoon sun as Richard Caldwell and the others approached it with measured steps. The short grass rolled smoothly beneath their shoes, and the quiet murmur of spectators gathered behind the rope line carried softly through the warm air. Richard studied the ball resting near the front edge of the green and crouched slightly to read the slope. The earlier frustration beneath the oak tree had faded from his face, replaced by the calm focus of someone preparing for a clean finish. One of the other millionaires stood behind him with folded arms and said that the recovery shot had saved the hole. Richard nodded once, but did not respond. His attention remained on the thin line between the ball and the cup several yards away. Marcus Reed stopped near the edge of the green and set the golf bag gently on the ground. The metal heads of the clubs touched softly together inside the bag as he stepped back. Ethan Caldwell stood beside him again, watching the scene with the same quiet curiosity that had followed him since the beginning of the round. The boy glanced up at Marcus and spoke in a soft voice. "You looked at the clubhouse again when the announcer started talking," he said. Marcus kept his eyes on the green where Richard prepared a putt. "Sometimes announcements matter," he replied calmly. Ethan looked toward the distant clubhouse patio where a large crowd had gathered near the announcer's stand. The scoreboard beside the patio reflected the sunlight like a tall mirror above the people standing there. The loudspeaker voice continued drifting across the course. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Lakeshore Charity Invitational Exhibition Round. We are honored to have so many wonderful guests supporting the community youth program." The voice echoed gently across the fairway while the spectators around the green listened with mild interest. Richard positioned the putter behind the ball and made a slow, careful stroke. The ball rolled smoothly across the green, curving slightly along the slope before stopping only a few feet from the cup. A small ripple of applause moved through the spectators nearby. Richard stood upright and gave a brief nod as if satisfied with the result. One of the men beside him said that the next putt should be simple. Richard walked forward toward the ball, preparing to finish the hole. Marcus remained quietly near the bag while the announcer voice continued speaking from the clubhouse. "We would also like to recognize the talented players who will be participating in our special exhibition match this afternoon." The crowd near the patio grew quieter as the announcer paused briefly. Ethan noticed Marcus listening more closely now. The calm expression on the caddie face had not changed, but his eyes were focused toward the clubhouse again. Richard tapped the final putt, and the ball dropped cleanly into the cup. A few spectators clapped politely as he retrieved it and slipped it into his pocket. "Good recovery," one of the men said. Richard gave a small smile and began walking toward the path that led to the next tee box. Marcus lifted the golf bag once more and followed a few steps behind him. Ethan stayed close beside him, as usual. The announcer voice returned through the loudspeaker, now slightly louder and clearer as the wind shifted across the course. "Before we continue with the next group," the announcer said, "we would like to welcome a very special guest who will be joining the exhibition round today." The words floated across the fairway and reached the green where Richard and the others were walking. Several spectators turned their heads toward the clubhouse again. Ethan slowed his steps slightly while listening. Marcus also slowed for a brief moment, though his posture remained relaxed. The announcer paused again, creating a small pocket of silence across the course. The crowd near the clubhouse leaned closer to hear the next words. Marcus' eyes moved once more toward the scoreboard beside the announcer's stand. Richard Caldwell and the other millionaires continued walking ahead without paying much attention to the announcement behind them. They were already discussing the next hole and the distance to the next green. The announcer voice returned through the loudspeaker, stronger now, carrying clearly across the entire course. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to one of the players joining our exhibition match today. The crowd grew completely quiet for a single breath while the announcer prepared to say the name. The entire golf course seemed to hold its breath after the announcer paused. The soft breeze that moved across the fairway carried the faint hum of anticipation from the crowd gathered near the clubhouse patio. Richard Caldwell and the other millionaires had nearly reached the path leading toward the next tee box when the voice from the loudspeaker returned, now clearer and stronger than before. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our special exhibition player for this afternoon. The words echoed gently across the green and the surrounding fairway. Several spectators along the rope line turned their attention fully toward the clubhouse where the announcer stood beside the microphone. Marcus Reed slowed his steps slightly as he walked behind Richard with the golf bag resting across his shoulder. Ethan Caldwell noticed the small change in his pace and looked up at him again with quiet curiosity. The boy had sensed something unusual building ever since the announcement began. The announcer continued, speaking in a confident tone that carried across the entire course. This player has an extraordinary story and has inspired many young athletes across the country. We are honored to have him joining us today for the charity exhibition match. A ripple of interest moved through the crowd near the clubhouse patio. People leaned closer to hear the name that would follow. Richard Caldwell stopped walking for a moment and glanced over his shoulder toward the clubhouse. One of the other millionaires shrugged and said that the event organizers probably invited some celebrity athlete to attract attention. Another man nodded and said that charity tournaments always loved dramatic introductions. Ethan continued looking at Marcus instead of the clubhouse. The boy noticed that Marcus' face remained calm but thoughtful, the same quiet expression he had shown several times during the afternoon. Marcus' eyes were fixed on the announcer stand in the distance. The loudspeaker crackled softly again as the announcer prepared to continue. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our special exhibition guest and former national amateur golf champion. The words drifted slowly across the course, and the crowd grew noticeably quieter. Richard Caldwell raised his eyebrows with mild interest. Former national champion, he repeated under his breath. That might actually be worth watching. The announcer voice continued without pause. A player whose career has inspired young golfers across the country and whose story reminds us that talent can appear in the most unexpected places. Marcus remained completely still behind the group. The leather strap of the golf bag rested firmly across his shoulder, but his posture had changed slightly. Ethan noticed it immediately. The boy tilted his head and looked between Marcus and the clubhouse again, as if a realization was beginning to form. The announcer paused for a brief moment that seemed to stretch across the entire fairway. The spectators near the clubhouse leaned forward in anticipation. Even the golfers on nearby holes seemed to slow their movements while the name was about to be spoken. Richard Caldwell and the others waited with casual curiosity, still unaware of what was about to happen. The announcer voice finally returned through the loudspeaker with clear emphasis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcus Reed. For a brief second, the words hung in the air like a sudden gust of wind across the quiet course. Ethan's eyes widened immediately as he turned toward Marcus. Richard Caldwell froze mid-step and slowly looked back over his shoulder. The other millionaires stared in confusion as the name echoed across the fairway once more through the loudspeaker. Marcus Reed. Applause began rising near the clubhouse patio where the announcer stood beside the scoreboard. Several spectators closer to the green began clapping as well after recognizing the name. Marcus lowered the golf bag gently to the ground beside the path. The metal clubs touched softly together inside the bag. He adjusted the cuff of his glove and looked calmly toward the clubhouse patio where the crowd had started applauding. Richard Caldwell stood completely silent now as the realization settled across his face. The caddie who had been carrying his bag all afternoon had just been introduced to the entire golf course. Marcus took a slow breath and began walking toward the clubhouse direction while the applause continued to spread across the fairway behind him. The applause spreading across the golf course moved like a slow wave of sound that reached the green, the fairway, and finally the narrow path where Richard Caldwell and the other millionaires still stood frozen. For several seconds, no one spoke. The words from the loudspeaker still echoed faintly in the warm afternoon air. Marcus Reed. The name had carried across the entire course with calm certainty, and now the crowd, near the clubhouse patio, was clearly reacting to it. More people began clapping as the announcer repeated the welcome. Marcus Reed, former national amateur champion, joining our exhibition match today. Marcus Reed stood beside the path where he had gently placed the golf bag on the grass. His posture remained calm, the same quiet confidence he had carried all afternoon while walking behind the group. Ethan Caldwell stared at him with wide eyes, the pieces finally falling together in the mind of the curious boy. "You are the player," Ethan said softly. Marcus looked down at him and gave a small, respectful nod. "Something like that," he replied. Richard Caldwell remained several steps ahead, his body still turned halfway toward the clubhouse where the applause continued to grow. The realization moved slowly across his face. He looked from Marcus to the bag that had been resting on the caddie's shoulder only moments earlier. The same bag that Marcus had carried across the fairway, without complaint while listening to every careless remark. One of the other millionaires cleared his throat awkwardly. "Wait a minute," he said quietly. "You mean the caddie was the champion the whole time?" The words sounded strange even as he spoke them. Another man rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward Marcus with sudden embarrassment. The laughter from earlier beneath the oak tree seemed very far away now. Richard finally walked back toward Marcus with slower steps than before. The confident posture he had shown all afternoon had softened into something closer to uncertainty. The applause from the clubhouse patio continued drifting across the fairway, while several spectators near the rope line began turning toward Marcus with recognition. Some of them had already started whispering his name. Richard stopped a few feet away and looked directly at him for the first time without the earlier smirk. "You were carrying my bag," he said quietly. Marcus nodded once. "It was a good walk," he replied calmly. Ethan could not hide his excitement any longer. "My dad said golf takes years to understand, and you knew the shot the whole time," the boy said. Marcus smiled slightly. "Sometimes the course speaks if you listen," he repeated gently. Richard looked down at the golf bag, resting on the grass, and then back at Marcus again. The silence between them lasted several seconds while the applause from the clubhouse continued. "I made a fool of myself out here today," Richard said finally. Marcus shook his head slowly. "No, sir," he replied. "You played the course the same way everyone does." Richard studied his face as if searching for sarcasm, but found none. Marcus' voice carried no bitterness, only calm honesty. One of the other millionaires stepped forward and extended a hand toward Marcus with an awkward smile. "I think we owe you an apology," he said. Marcus accepted the handshake politely. "No apology is necessary," he answered. "We were all just enjoying the game." The loudspeaker voice returned once more from the clubhouse patio. "Marcus Reed, please join us at the first tee for the exhibition match." The crowd near the patio applauded again, while several spectators closer to the green began pointing toward Marcus' location. Ethan looked up at Marcus with admiration that was impossible to hide. "You are really going to play now," he said. Marcus lifted the golf bag from the ground and rested it across his shoulder once more. For a brief moment he looked at Richard Caldwell and the other men standing beside the path. His voice remained calm and respectful. "Thank you for the walk across the course," he said. Then he turned toward the clubhouse and began walking toward the first tee where the announcer and the waiting crowd were expecting him. Marcus Reed walked steadily along the path toward the clubhouse and the first tee while the applause continued to rise across the golf course. The sound followed him like a warm current carried by the afternoon breeze. Spectators standing near the rope line began turning fully toward him now, some whispering his name as recognition spread through the crowd. A few people lifted their phones to record the moment, while others simply watched with curiosity. The tall scoreboard near the clubhouse patio reflected the sunlight in bright flashes as Marcus approached. Behind him, Richard Caldwell and the other millionaires remained standing near the path in stunned silence. The scene that had unfolded only minutes earlier beneath the oak tree replayed clearly in Richard's mind. The careless jokes, the laughter, the quiet caddie carrying the bag without complaint. Richard exhaled slowly and shook his head as if trying to clear the weight of the realization. One of the men beside him spoke quietly. We were standing next to a national champion, and we treated him like the help. The words carried a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes followed Marcus walking toward the first tee, where the announcer waited beside the microphone stand. Ethan Caldwell had already begun jogging lightly along the rope line to get a better view near the tee box. The boy could barely contain his excitement. When Marcus reached the edge of the patio area, a tournament official stepped forward to greet him with a firm handshake. The applause from the gathered crowd grew louder for a moment as the announcer spoke again through the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcus Reed to the exhibition tee. Marcus placed the golf bag down beside the tee marker and accepted a club from one of the officials assisting with the exhibition round. The sunlight illuminated the polished head of the driver as he turned it once in his hands. The quiet confidence in his movements drew the attention of nearly everyone standing nearby. Several younger spectators moved closer to the rope line, watching carefully as if they were witnessing something important. Back near the path, Richard Caldwell finally began walking slowly toward the first tee as well. The other millionaires followed beside him, their earlier confidence replaced with thoughtful silence. Richard stopped near the rope line just as Marcus stepped onto the tee box. The crowd grew quiet again while the announcer spoke into the microphone. Marcus Reed first made headlines as a young amateur champion whose calm style and precision earned respect across the country. Today, he joins us not only as a competitor, but as a reminder that greatness sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways. The statement hung gently in the air as Marcus positioned the golf ball on the tee. Ethan stood near the front of the rope line, watching with wide eyes. Richard folded his arms quietly while studying the player he had unknowingly asked for advice only minutes earlier. Marcus took a slow breath and looked down the fairway. The same fairway he had walked across while carrying the bag. The same fairway where he had listened patiently to every remark. Now the entire crowd watched him with admiration instead of indifference. Marcus set his stance carefully and gripped the driver with relaxed confidence. The wind moved lightly across the grass while the flag near the distant green fluttered softly. For a brief moment the course felt perfectly still. Then Marcus swung the club with smooth, effortless power. The driver struck the ball with a clean, bright sound that echoed across the course. The ball rose high into the blue sky and traveled straight down the center of the fairway, flying farther than any shot played earlier that afternoon. A wave of impressed murmurs spread through the crowd, followed quickly by loud applause. Ethan clapped enthusiastically while several spectators shook their heads in amazement. Richard Caldwell watched the ball land perfectly in the center of the fairway, nearly 300 yards away. He lowered his eyes briefly and let out a quiet breath. Sometimes the course speaks if you listen, he murmured to himself, repeating the words Marcus had spoken earlier beneath the oak tree. The ball that Marcus Reed sent soaring down the fairway continued to roll long after it touched the grass, finally coming to rest in the exact center of the hole, as if the course itself had opened a path for it. The applause that followed was louder than anything heard that afternoon. Spectators along the rope line clapped enthusiastically while others shook their heads in admiration. Some of the younger golfers standing near the clubhouse leaned forward with wide eyes, watching the calm player who had just delivered the longest and most effortless drive of the entire event. Marcus remained still for a moment on the tee box, the driver resting lightly in his hands. His expression did not change. The same quiet confidence that had followed him across the course while carrying the bag remained on his face. The announcer voice returned through the loudspeaker, filled with enthusiasm. That is the kind of shot that made Marcus Reed a national amateur champion. The words drifted across the course as the crowd continued clapping. Near the rope line, Richard Caldwell stood silently with his arms folded. The ball still resting in the center of the fairway seemed almost symbolic now. Only a short time earlier Marcus had been walking behind him, carrying a bag and listening to careless remarks. Now the same man stood on the tee box with the entire tournament watching him. Ethan Caldwell was clapping the loudest of anyone near the rope line. "That was incredible," he shouted with excitement. Marcus looked toward the crowd and gave the boy a small nod of appreciation. Then he stepped down from the tee box and began walking toward the fairway where the ball had landed. The crowd slowly followed along the rope line as the exhibition round continued. Richard hesitated for a moment before stepping forward as well. As Marcus approached the fairway, Richard closed the distance between them and spoke in a quieter voice than he had used all afternoon. "I owe you more than a handshake," he said. Marcus stopped and looked at him calmly. Richard continued speaking. "Earlier today, I thought I understood this game. I thought I understood the people around me. Turns out I was wrong about both." Marcus considered the words for a moment. The breeze moved gently across the fairway, and the flag near the green fluttered softly. "Golf is a way of teaching people things," Marcus replied. "Sometimes it teaches patience. Sometimes it teaches humility." Richard nodded slowly, accepting the lesson without argument. Ethan stepped closer beside them, still smiling with excitement. "You are my favorite player now," he said honestly. Marcus laughed softly for the first time that afternoon. "Just remember the real lesson," he told the boy. "Respect the game and respect the people walking the course with you." Ethan nodded seriously, as if the advice carried more weight than any golf instruction he had ever heard. The exhibition round continued across the course, with Marcus delivering precise shots that kept the crowd watching every movement. By the time the final hole ended, the applause had followed him from tee to green across the entire course. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, Marcus stood once more near the clubhouse patio where the scoreboard displayed the results of the exhibition match. The crowd gave him one final round of applause before slowly beginning to disperse. Richard Caldwell approached him again and extended his hand, this time without hesitation. "Thank you for reminding me what this game is really about," he said. Marcus shook his hand calmly. "It is never about the clubs or the money," he replied. "It is about the character you bring to the course." Richard watched him walk away toward the parking area where the evening light stretched across the grass in long golden lines. Only then did he fully understand the quiet lesson hidden inside the afternoon. They had laughed at the man carrying the bag. In the end, he was the one who carried the dignity of the entire game.